Hello there, I'm Ingrid De Oliveira. I'll be hosting this interview as part of a follow-up series of interviews to the FIF UK's Digital ID webinar. FIF UK is a UK-based network which aims to raise awareness of financial inclusion and spreading best practice worldwide. And again, I am Ingrid, and I'm a master's student at the University of Nottingham. And I assisted FIF UK in making this digital ID webinar happen. And today we have Emrys Schoemaker, and he is a researcher and strategist who spoke at FIF UK's last webinar. And he works with one of the working groups for the UK, advising about digital ID. And he spoke last time in the webinar about digital ID's potential and limitations. And it's a real pleasure to have you today with us, Emrys.
Pleasure to be here.
And without further ado, we'll get to the questions, some popular questions that came up in the webinar. So could you tell us a little bit about what the digital practitioners in the UK are doing about digital ID and yourself?
Of course. So it's a great pleasure to be here, Olivia. Thank you for the invitation, and also to FIF for hosting the event, which brought together such a wide range of views and discussions. I shared my perspectives and experiences of digital identification quite broadly, but in terms of what's happening in the UK, I think there's a number of things that are happening. The first thing, and perhaps the most significant, is that the government is developing two measures to support the development of digital identification in the UK. The first is the development of a trust framework, which sets the rules of the road for how identity is managed and verified, and how individuals, identity issuers and relying parties can ensure that the individuals are who they say they are and they possess the attributes that they claim to possess. So one of the things that, and the other thing that the UK government is doing is developing a government-issued national ID, which is still at much earlier stages. For the first, the development of a trust framework is a significant innovation and advancement in thinking about identification compared to initiatives that have focused on a centrally issued state ID. And there's two reasons why, there's multiple reasons why that's significant, but two of those reasons are, firstly, we know from our research around the world, looking at how identification systems are used by different stakeholders, that when data is collected centrally, that data is a honeypot for hackers, and as we know from that recent Facebook exploit, is almost inevitably revealed. So collecting data centrally is increasingly recognized as not a good idea. So a trust framework that governs how identity is managed rather than a centralized product or service is a welcome innovation. And secondly, the approach to establishing a trust framework builds on recognized innovation and advancement in the provision of identification, such as the model developed in Canada, the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, such as the approach to identification in Bangkok, in Australia, and emerging innovation in the Netherlands as well. So I think it's really welcome to recognize this approach to setting the rules of the road, setting standards for how identification is practiced in the UK. And I think this is something to be welcomed, but of course also to be watched. and to make sure that the innovation that's being developed is fit for purpose, meets individual needs. And as we know with so many identification systems, they tend to be developed by institutions providing services in order to manage that service. And when we think about what that looks like in the UK, it's going to be really important to make sure that the governance of this new trust framework is independent, that it includes diverse stakeholders and specifically includes citizen representatives in order to ensure that their interests are incorporated into the process and management of this trust framework. The second innovation and the second area of work that's currently being developed is the national ID scheme being developed by central government. And this is one where I think we really need to wait and see. The history of national identity in the UK is largely that it's been rejected by both the public and by politicians, largely because A, it's not seen as being very efficient, and B, it's an infraction of individual privacy, which is increasingly recognized as being significant. So I think those are the two main innovations, and the work that myself and many other deeply expert practitioners around the field of digital identity are currently engaging in supporting certainly the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in developing this trust framework. And we welcome the outreach that the department is engaged in and the inclusion of diverse perspectives and stakeholders. And this consultation has included seeking input into a wide range of elements of the trust framework in order to ensure that it reflects a diverse body and a diverse set of perspectives.
And I want to know, will this be piloted first? So sandboxed?
I think that's being explored. I think there's current thinking around the best ways of rolling it out. But I know that their consultation with industry and the public sector, etc., they will find and explore what the most optimal route to deployment actually is.
Okay. And many people wanted to know, well, they had questions about data security. So how could the government and the private sector improve citizens' data security and ownership to increase the trust and willingness of citizens to adopt digital ID?
So I think the critical determinants of the trust framework's role in establishing trust in digital identity is going to be the standards that it sets for the way identity is issued, including how data is collected, what data is collected, how that data is managed, and also how that data is shared with others. And I think the critical factors is going to be trying to establish a framework that enables data sharing, but maintains individual privacy, which obviously restricts data sharing. And I think the route to that trust is going to be, as far as I'm aware, the issuance of a trust mark, so that identity issuers can demonstrate that they meet certain standards around the way data is collected, managed, and shared, and that individuals and relying parties can look at these identity issuers and have confidence that those institutions are managing data and privacy in appropriate ways. But ultimately, not only are standards important and marks of compliance, such as a trust framework, important, but more important is going to be accountability and the means of recourse when things inevitably go wrong. And I think this is going to be really important for the trust framework to establish are appropriate levels of grievance redress mechanisms, of transparency, so that when problems do occur, that they're dealt with in clear and transparent ways. And this, I think, will be critical to ensuring that individuals trust digital identification. The question of adoption, I think, is a difficult one because we know that nobody really wants an ID and nobody really likes sharing personal data. So I think the most likely drivers, the most common drivers of adoption, such as Aadhaar in India, which is held as the most successful digital identity scheme in the world, the drivers of adoption were because people had to get it in order to get things they needed. So I think we can learn from that and see that a likely driver of adoption in the UK is where people need some form of identification, they will get it, and this will drive adoption. But more than that, I hope that the trust framework accommodates ways in which sharing of confirmation that people have a certain attribute, that they are of a certain age, that they have a certain qualification, that they have a license to drive or to practice law or whatever it might be, that it will be possible for other relying parties to check with the identity issuer that the individual is A, unique, that they are who they say they are, and B, that they possess the attributes that they claim to have, that they are able to drive or allowed to buy alcohol or whatever it might be, and that the issuing body can confirm that that individual meets that criteria without necessarily having to share that personal information. So for example, if I want to go to a doctor or I want to sign up for a health plan, that I can say that the doctor meets, that I have certain medical records, and the doctor can say, yes, he has them without necessarily sharing that data. And I think that that will be a really important criteria for success for the trust framework, is the degree to which it enables, accommodates and supports identity confirmation or attribute confirmation without requiring the sharing of personal data and even supporting limiting sharing of personal data.
Okay, so to get this ID, people would still need normal forms of ID, such as driver's license, passports, to apply for this, right?
I think that's still being worked out. I think different identity issuers may have different requirements. And what both the trust framework, but also national and international regulations stipulate what kind of documentation or proof is required to prove that you are who you say you are, that meets certain levels of assurance. So for example, maybe you only have a photograph that proves biometrically that you are who you say you are. But maybe you want, to prove where you live. You need to be able to provide proof of address. And there may be different forms of proof of that, utility statement or land records even. There may be different ways of proving certain attributes that you have, such as your age or your gender, or your qualifications, such as ability to drive, or that you've reached certain, you have obtained certain educational criteria. So for example, when you finish your master's program, sometimes somebody might want to know that Olivia has a master's, and maybe the university will be able to confirm, yes, she has a master's, without necessarily specifying what the master's is. Maybe a different relying party would need to know what grade you got or what the subject was. And depending on what kind of information is required, various forms of proof will be needed in order to verify that that's the case. The more identity data that you provide, the higher the level of assurance that a relying party, that an organization or an individual can have, that you are who you say you are, and that the claims that you make about yourself are reliable and they can have confidence in them. So I think how much data you have to share in order to access a certain identity or certain level of assurance about about yourself will vary according to the identity issuer.
So the government UK Verify scheme, I've used that before. I've used the post office application, but I've read that's well, they're not going anywhere with that. So this, what you're talking about, is not an extension of the government Verify scheme.
No, so the difference between Verify and the trust framework, as far as my understanding goes, is that Verify basically enabled mainly private sector organizations, businesses, to issue an ID, and that they would be able to claim from the government a certain amount for each identity that they created. And the reason that that failed was because there was no need for those identities, and the private sector was not able to make as much money from the issuing of those identities as they had anticipated. So far fewer numbers of people subscribed to Verify, and so it's largely regarded as being a failure. What the trust framework sets out to do is to create standards for the way any organization proves that an individual is who they say they are and has certain attributes. And so what the difference between Verify and the trust framework is that the trust framework is much broader, is not exclusive in terms of which organizations are identity issuers, and doesn't seek to create a market in identity issuance that's backed by the state.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. So in terms of financial inclusion, do you think it'd be more efficient to focus on integrating excluded individuals, such as homeless people who need proof of address or ID to open a bank account, for example? Do you think it's more efficient to include them in existing ID schemes rather than changing the whole identification infrastructure when it comes to financial inclusion?
Can you give me an example?
So you were saying how this new identification infrastructure that the UK is working on, it could include diverse groups. Isn't that what you said? Do you think that would help more in terms of financial inclusion for example, homeless people or people who can't get an ID easily? Or do you think changing, for example, the law or policies to include people in existing ID schemes would be better in terms of financial inclusion?
I think in terms of financial inclusion, and by financial inclusion we mean being able to open a bank account, presumably, and being able to access credit, then the determinants of what different groups have to present in order to get those services is determined under national and international regulations. And we've found from research on other vulnerable groups, such as refugees in other countries, such as Lebanon, Jordan, and other places, that regardless of the identities that they hold, the legal status that they possess determines their ability to access certain services. And by that I mean, regardless of whether an organization issues a form of ID that may be very advanced or may have very high levels of assurance that they're able to assert that this person is who they say they are, it's national law which determines whether or not a refugee is able to get a bank account. And similarly, if the requirement to open a bank account is that you have an address, then if you're homeless and you don't have an address, you won't be able to get a bank account, regardless of whatever form of identity you actually hold. Maybe you have a passport or a driving license. Maybe you have one of a new post office issued ID, if that's what they end up doing. But if the law says without address you can't get a bank account, then you still won't be able to get a bank account. And so I think we often focus on the technology and the system as being the solution to problems that are not technical or system problems. And very often, when we talk about identity, what we're really often usually talking about is a relationship and a transaction, something that somebody wants to do, something that somebody wants to get. And what determines whether they're able to get it is not just whether they have a card or a number or something with their thumbprint on it, but whether or not the law says that this person is entitled to access this service. And whether or not I have a driving license in my hand, I am entitled to drive because I've passed a test and the DVLA holds a record of that. And the law says, if I have a driving license and I pass the test, then I can drive. Or even if I don't have proof of age, I'm still entitled to buy alcohol, for example. But just because I don't have the card, the law doesn't prevent me. It's the provider who may require proof of it. And so I think it's as much about technical systems as it is about, even more so about national and international regulation. And that's what we need to be looking at when we're thinking about how marginalized or excluded groups can be further included in accessing financial services.
And what kind of laws or policies do you think the government could look into to help these excluded people?
I think you'd have to look at each individual group and figure out what the law that is limiting their inclusion in whatever service they want to access is. And that's where I think you need to start. The identity questions come second. But I think we need to be very specific about particular groups. And I'm far from a national or international legal expert on specific services.
And with digital ID, there's a risk of government or group of people abusing the power and persecuting certain groups or individuals. Do you think, has your work identified any potential safeguards against this?
Yes, this is a really interesting question. I mean, people I've spoken to who look at the use of the collection of personal data and the use of identification systems to manage access to services. Some have said, oh, these are the perfect tools for genocide, for example. Imagine if in Rwanda there had been a comprehensive national ID and people had been able to separate Hutus from Tutsis, etc. And I think this is right. You know, I think these technologies are very powerful tools. And it's critically important that we find ways of limiting the way that these technologies are misused. One of the ways is to limit the centralization of data. So to minimize or to avoid national ID schemes where the government collects data and stores it centrally. And I think this is one of the challenges for a country like, it's one of the challenges that faces a model like Estonia's X-Road, which is a centralized data platform, which is incredibly efficient, enables all sorts of innovation. And within a small homogeneous country like Estonia, that works really well. But in countries with diverse groups, with diverse populations and diverse interests and so on, you know, this can be more problematic. And we just need to look at what happened recently with Facebook to see that no centralized data collection is ever entirely safe. So firstly, one measure to take is to avoid the centralized collection of data. And that can look like decentralized forms of data collection, data storage. And there are lots of innovations in this area. I think the evolution of the self-sovereign identity community to a decentralized identity community is one that's really welcome. And a much more productive step to go in. So I think some of the decentralized approaches to identity that are being developed are helpful here. Microsoft, for example, has just rolled out one. But of course, people are always concerned about the private sector managing personal data, particularly around legal status and access to services. We saw, for example, how Pakistan's national ID scheme, developed by NADRA, widely hailed as one of the most successful national ID schemes, was recently used for political purposes to stop a Pashtun political rights activist from accessing any services. They cancelled his ID card. And so I think this is a good example of how ID schemes can be used for political purposes. And similarly in India, certain populations in the northeast of India on the border with Bangladesh have been prevented from enrolling in Aadhaar because there's a fear that they will access services or rights that they're not entitled to, or that there may be contested claims for citizenship or for entitlements. Another form of innovation that I think helps in this regard is taking the approach of a trust framework, which is not about collecting data, but specifying how data is collected, how it's managed, and how it's shared. And I think this is a really critical approach to ensure that we don't get hung up on the technical models, whether it's a particular database or decentralized platform, but rather saying, if you meet these rules, you meet these standards, then you can be an issuer of identity. And I think this is right. I think this is a much more constructive way to go. But critically, regardless of the technology, political interests will always seek to use tools to achieve their goals. And so the most effective mechanism against the misuse of data is an accountable state. And that means we need to make sure that politicians, that governments, that state bodies are governed appropriately, are managed transparently, and that they are accountable to the law, and that the law is independent of political interference. And this governance question, this politics question, is ultimately, I think, the critical determinant of how different technologies are used for political interest or for public interest.
Thank you. And for Estonia's digital ID system, you said it was successful because for them it's easier because it's a homogeneous country, and their technological infrastructure that was developed later compared to the UK, and it's also centralized their digital ID scheme. But do you think there are any beneficial aspects of their scheme that could be applied to the UK?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, yes, all of those factors that you mentioned were critical in Estonia's EID scheme's success. The other critical factor, I think, is they built their system with far fewer legacy systems and processes in place. When they became independent from the Soviet Union, they were able to create from a greenfield site, if you like, what the architecture of the state looked like. This meant they were able to build from the ground up a digital state which has allowed them to offer things like e-citizenship, for example, e-residency. And this is huge, this is really significant. I think the most important factor, certainly one of the most interesting factors in Estonia's model, is the transparency. So whenever a relying party wants to access my data, let's say a doctor wants to access my health record, or a health insurance provider wants to access my health record, or whatever, I can see who has accessed what data and when and why. And I think this visibility into how your data is being used is really helpful. Of course, visibility into how our data is accessed does not mean choice and control. I can't necessarily stop that data being accessed and used, but it's a really good step in that direction. And I think that kind of transparency is something that's very welcome. And I think that kind of transparency, in principle, should breed greater levels of confidence and trust.
And We thought about digital ID in the political sense and the technology behind it, but so culturally, there are cultures where certain groups of individuals are more likely to be financially excluded. So, for example, women needing permission from a husband or a male guardian to open a bank account. To what extent do you think digital ID could be leveraged to increase financial inclusion?
I'm sure it can be leveraged to increase financial inclusion and make it easier to access financial services. But just because someone is issued an ID doesn't suddenly remove the political and social context in which they lived. And I don't think anybody, I would hope, advocating for any form of digital identification scheme would argue that any form of technology is going to remove patriarchy. Women are unjustly marginalized, their agency is compromised, and ability to exercise control and make decisions is limited by historic forms of persecution and oppression. No identification scheme itself is going to resolve that. Changing that requires much bigger shifts in political and social norms around equality between men and women. And I think while we can recognize and embrace the potential for individuals to make choices and access services that identification schemes can enable, we should be under no illusions that those schemes themselves are going to be keys to unlock the cage of patriarchy and the oppression that it enables. That being said, I think where it's possible to enable individual access under the law and to strengthen the ability of individuals, marginalized individuals, women, but also marginalized groups, etc., to access rights and entitlements. Again, these are larger legal and political questions. And I don't think digital identification is going to be the sole key that solves for that, and certainly not for access to financial services. And again, access to financial services are governed by national and international regulations. The Financial Action Task Force, for example, specifies the forms of identification required in order to access financial services. And whatever kind of identification scheme you offer, a bank or other form of financial service provider is going to have to comply with those requirements. It's making sure that those requirements are sensitive to the political, social, and cultural context in which marginalization and oppression are experienced, that is going to be the key to future equality and access to services and financial inclusion. And let's also recognize that financial service providers also need to be governed by stronger legal, political, and accountability mechanisms. We increasingly see practices like payday lenders or alternative forms of credit provision where they don't require the same kind of identification, and they operate outside of the regulatory framework for things like banks. And they exploit that position to provide credit at extortionate and exploitative rates. So I think we also need to make sure that we're looking at the service provider and governing the service provision as much as we are around forms of identification required to access those services.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's important, I think, to remember that digital ID and other technological innovations, they're excellent sources of delivery of solutions, accelerators. But yeah, we also have to think about governance and other factors that might be excluding people. So thank you for your time. We don't have much time left, but thank you for your valuable insights, and thank you everybody for listening. It was very interesting and definitely something to really think about.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to share what little insight I have. I think the last thing I would say is a healthy way of looking at the way digital technologies impact society, and particularly social and cultural norms and power, is to recognize that technologies amplify the existing patterns of relations. Technologies are never neutral. They're neither good nor bad, but never neutral. And they amplify existing patterns of power and inequality unless explicitly designed to do otherwise. And that means we need to identify and understand the patterns of inequality in order to be able to design to solve for them. Unfortunately, most technologies and most systems are not designed with an insight and an understanding of patterns of inequality. And this is why it's so important for qualitative social research into understanding social, cultural, and political norms and practices and the way power is exercised, to collaborate and work closely with technologists and designers so that technologies can be designed to be informed by the society and the culture and the beliefs and the norms of the people who are going to be using and impacted by these technologies. So we need to have a much closer integration of social insight with technology design and deployment. But thank you very much for this opportunity to share a little of the research that we've been doing at Caribou Digital, and to contribute to some of the discussions around digital identification in the UK.
Well, thank you. And thank you everybody for listening. And if you want to get involved with Financial Inclusion Forum, and if you want to know more about Emrys or myself, you can read the video description. And thank you, Emrys, for your time again and all your insight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.